I would like to reflect a little bit this afternoon and talk about early Buddhism as a form of refined hedonism. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But first I would like to make two distinctions, which I think are quite important when we explore this area of pleasant feelings and pleasant experience in the practice. First is to distinguish between the experience of pleasure or enjoyment and desire, which we sometimes conflate. If we hear a criticism of pleasure, we take it as a criticism of desire, and the other way around. Of course, these two things are related, but they're still different things. So when I speak of pleasure, or I may use enjoyment, I mean the experience here and now of something that feels good. Whereas desire is the wish for something pleasant which is not occurring now. This includes, of course, the desire that whatever pleasant thing I'm experiencing now would continue, because it's about the future. So when I speak of pleasure, enjoyment, I refer really to something that we experience in the moment that feels good. And the other distinction is a distinction between pleasure, the experience of pleasure and enjoyment, and the object of that pleasure. So, let's say you had something for lunch that was very nice. Whatever food you like. Part of the experience of that food is not just pleasure. There may be texture and sweetness and temperature. There's all sorts of aspects to that experience, and one of them is its pleasantness or unpleasantness. And the pleasure or enjoyment or satisfaction we derive from something is not the same as the object itself. Chocolate cake, a piece of music, whatever it is. It contributes, but it's one of the factors that allows that experience of pleasure and enjoyment to arise. They're different because it's not inherent. If you go to any football match or something like this, you know that someone scores a goal or whatever it is, and that's not inherently pleasant or unpleasant. 50% of the audience thinks it's pleasant, the other 50% thinks it's unpleasant. If the experience of pleasure and the object were the same thing, either everyone would be happy or everyone would be sad. Not the case. And these experiences of pleasure are personal. They are conditioned by our individual histories, by our culture, how we grew up. Some of them also have evolutionary roots. It's not like we can decide. And yet they're still conditioned, and they're not always universal. To some degree, we've learned to like and dislike certain things. So that's why I speak of pleasure, but also use enjoyment sometimes, because it seems that enjoyment, the word enjoyment is a bit more clear that we're speaking of the experience of enjoying something, of appreciating something, of having a nice experience. So, back to the topic. Because we don't sometimes make these distinctions between pleasure and desire, and between pleasure and the object of pleasure, we tend to take Buddhism to be against pleasure. And a lot of the literature from Buddhism and the teachings seem to confirm that. And some Buddhist traditions have gone in that direction, but when we go back to the earliest Buddhist teachings, what we find is that pleasure is taken as an inherent good, and pain as an inherent bad. All organisms share this. From the tiniest living organism, they get away from what feels bad and they try to stay or seek what feels good. And as I said this morning, sometimes these tendencies get us into trouble, but they're not inherently problematic. They also tell us something about the world and something about our experience. And if we touch something that's burning, quite automatically we withdraw our hand from that object. So actually, Buddhist ethics, this idea of how to live well, is built on the idea that it is our natural inclination to avoid what's unpleasant and approach what is pleasant, which paradoxically requires to embrace the existence of that which is unpleasant, in a way, what's difficult in life, what's imperfect. I also look at this very much in collective terms, because in our very individual societies and sometimes navel-gazing habits that we learn, we think very much in individual terms. So suffering, my suffering, and pleasure, my pleasure. But when I think of suffering in the Dharma, I think not so much of the individual experience of suffering, but of the fact that we create suffering, we harm. And we do that not because it is our intention to harm, but because there are patterns, we're clumsy, things get complicated, and we harm. And that is for me more important than just the mere fact of suffering in the Dharma, is how can I find freedom from harming? How can I learn not to create suffering for others and not to create suffering for myself? Because there's already a given tragedy to life. It's already baked into the recipe. Perhaps we don't need to add any more tension and any more suffering. So it's an ethical orientation for me. That the truth about suffering is also the truth about harming. And how do we reach the cessation of harming? So it's already this ethical perspective of how we live together. I said that early Buddhism is a form of refined hedonism. So it is hedonistic, which is a word that comes from the Greek tradition of philosophy, which means a system that considers that pleasure or happiness or any related terms, this is the greatest good. And Buddhism follows this idea, but what it criticizes is not so much that we approach pleasure or that we like pleasure. It criticizes what we deem to be actually pleasurable or not. It upsets our judgment on what actually is a nourishing, sustainable form of well-being. It considers that we're quite clumsy at distinguishing what brings us pleasure and well-being and what doesn't. We're clumsy in that pursuit. As I said this morning, we're quite bad at enjoying. It considers that we settle for the least sophisticated type of pleasures available. The ones that are very fleeting, short-term, sometimes connected to mid or long-term harm, collateral pain. For types of pleasure that are not very sustainable, that are very unreliable because they depend very much on external phenomena that are not at our command. And also, we settle for types of enjoyment that are sometimes at the expense of others, at the expense of other types of well-being. So it starts from the idea that pleasure is good and we should seek it, and then it says you're just settling for the worst type. You're just buying Tetra Pak wine, and there's better stuff than this. And once you learn to enjoy it, you will not be able to go back to the Tetra Pak wine. So take that tendency, take that appreciation and educate it. Educate your desire and educate your appreciation and your enjoyment. And also learn to place realistic expectations on each type of pleasure. I remember once I was talking to a friend many years ago, and I was being a little bit sanctimonious and preachy, just trying to smuggle the Dharma into the conversation and talking about, I don't know, let's say chocolate cake, to use an example that we mentioned this morning, and saying, chocolate cake is very nice, but it ends, so it doesn't really make you happy. And I remember my friend looking at me and saying in a very sobering way, he's like, why would you expect chocolate cake to make you happy in the first place? And I thought, well, good point. The pleasure is not in the cake. The problem, is not in the cake. The problem is in what do I expect the cake to deliver? Are my expectations in line of what the chocolate cake can deliver? Of course, my friend was also naive, because very often we do seek lasting satisfaction in places that cannot deliver it. So this is part of our learning of pleasure, our learning to enjoy. So let's say that there are different types of pleasure and that they have different characteristics. Things that are not chocolate cake might be more reliable forms of feeling good, less dependent on external phenomena. Some types of pleasure that bring less agitation and rumination. Some help to gather the mind, help to soothe the mind. And perhaps we had a taste of this morning, with learning to appreciate our generosity, our good qualities, learning to find some ease and comfort in the breath, in the body. This is a type of pleasant experience that depends less on external phenomena, is free, which I think is quite a bonus. It's more sustainable, is not at the expense of others, and sometimes it's even because of the benefit for others. Some forms of connecting, of being kind, we also benefit from them. They're built on connection with others rather than objectifying others, for example. And here we can include non-human animals as well. Buddhism has a lot of terms for the different types of pleasure, so it's a bit confusing. So I found a way to simplify it using 3 categories that come from evolutionary theory, and I hope you find them useful so far. A lot of people seem to find this useful, and then we'll make some exercise, some reflection on this. The 3 are novelty pleasure, mastery pleasure, and play pleasure. So I will explain each of these. Novelty pleasure, or also called replenishment pleasure, is what we usually call pleasure. So chocolate cake, anything that comes from the senses, food, sex, this is novelty pleasure. It's a pleasure that is closely tied to sensory stimuli, to changes in the environment, to impulses from within, to serve some immediate needs. So this is one type of pleasure. So we can think how that type of pleasure relates to duration, reliability. How does it connect to whether it is at the expense or benefit of others? How addictive, or what forms of collateral pain it may bring. Then there is mastery pleasure. And mastery pleasure is a pleasure that it's sort of an acquired taste. Any baby will go for the chocolate cake or what's fatty and sugary, but then as we educate kids, we teach them to find pleasure beyond those type of tastes and to learn to appreciate other foods that are also healthy for them. So they learn to derive pleasure from it. And as I said this morning, it is an indispensable element of any learning to find pleasure in it. If you're learning a language, a musical instrument, things that take certain effort, they take some learning to delay gratification, to train skills, and we can learn to derive pleasure from these things. And then we are using our affective kind of part of the organism as part of that education. Even complex endeavors like writing a book, getting a degree, they require us to learn to find pleasure in them. And it's not something as immediate, but we learn, like any acquired taste. So sometimes mastery pleasure comes precisely from mastering our relationship to novelty pleasure and our immediate impulses. And in terms of Dharma practice, I think examples of novelty pleasure, beyond what I've said, like learning a language or any skill, in terms of Dharma practice, things like generosity, ethics, kindness, metta, friendliness, are examples of mastery pleasure, which is to derive satisfaction from training our abilities. There's a show on Netflix that I quite enjoyed. It's called The Good Place. Does anyone know The Good Place? Yeah? So there's a moment that is really interesting where one of the main characters, Eleanor, she has a moral epiphany when she realizes that every time that she behaved in a horrible way, there was a little voice in her head telling her, "You're better than this. This is not good. You shouldn't do this." A voice that she ignored, of course. And when she starts learning to become a better person, it takes some time, but she realizes that that voice is gone. And realizing the absence of that voice brings a lot of relief. It feels good. But it takes her a bit of time to discover this, because absences are very hard to notice. So part of this training is, can I learn gradually to notice the absence of tension, the release of tension, the absence of reactivity, or at least reduced tension? Can I learn to take pleasure in reduced tension, in the absence of anger, in the absence of greed, in the absence of fear, expectations? Can I learn to take pleasure, which requires first to notice the absence of these things? Just like Eleanor realized that that voice in her head was gone. The lack of regret in technical Buddhist terms. It is the pleasure of the lack of regret, when you know that you're doing something that is not harmful. And then there's play pleasure. Play pleasure is really interesting. It's a type of pleasure that does not serve any immediate needs like hunger or thirst, like novelty pleasure often does. And it requires some skills, so it requires some mastery, but it goes beyond mastery pleasure. It's a pleasure for its own sake. It's the pleasure of being playful with experience. So games are an example of play pleasure, but also things like artistic appreciation. When we learn to appreciate a piece of music or painting or literature, this is an experience that has a sensory component, but that's not where the pleasure mostly comes from. If you read a novel, the satisfaction you derive from doing that, does it come because the page is just so gorgeous? The font that they choose for the book, no, it engages your imagination, your capacity to be creative, to be playful. Humor as well, even the pleasure we can find in movement, like the one we did, or if anyone here likes Qigong or Tai Chi or any form of dancing, interpretative dancing. And that includes as well some meditative states that we encounter in our practice, which are peaceful and sometimes quite blissful as well. So all these are forms of play pleasure. So novelty pleasure is a given, but the others are not. It's something we learn. And it's actually quite easy to miss out on it. So when I gave the example earlier of bringing a bag of mandarins to the office, sometimes we do many of these things without stopping to kind of take them in. Just like, yeah, we do that thing, or we feel that we do it out of duty, or it's become something mechanic, and we just miss out on some potential mastery pleasure, ethical pleasure, the enjoyment of generosity, even of little things. There's also a challenge, which is a cultural challenge, that it seems in our culture we're suspicious of enjoying being ethical. Well, if you're deriving any satisfaction from it, then are you really being altruistic? Are your motives where they should be? We're suspicious of enjoying good actions, of enjoying our virtues. We feel that maybe it corrupts them. And that's very, very different from Buddhist thought, which takes the fact that being kind feels good as a bonus, as a win-win. Forms of relating to others that benefit others and benefit ourselves. It's not an either-or. It's not either I enjoy something selfishly at the expense of the suffering of others, or I sacrifice my well-being for the happiness of others. It's not an either-or. There are win-wins. And there's another challenge, which I think this is Dharma specific. I mean, it's also cultural. But a lot of the times when I've heard teachings about pleasure and desire as part of the Dharma, they recommend basically moderation. That's what they recommend. Say, well, we are lay practitioners, so we are going to enjoy sense pleasures. Just do so with moderation. And I've always found this a bit inadequate and insufficient as a teaching. And more recently, I also felt that it's not only an insufficient advice, it's also boring. Just enjoy cake, but just a small portion. Just do this, but not too much. It's just a quantitative advice. I don't think it's enough. And so I find this reflection on distinguishing different types of pleasure really useful, because then it's not a matter of moderation, it's a matter of diversifying our sources of pleasure. And how much weight we give to each one, which ones do we cultivate, and which expectations do we have for each one.